Before dawn on February 27, 2014, armed men entered the parliament building in Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. They wore modern uniforms without national insignia. Within hours, a Russian flag flew above the building, while armed units controlled airports, communications sites, and approaches to Ukrainian bases. There had been no declaration of war. Moscow initially described the forces as local self-defense groups. Russia would later acknowledge that its servicemen had supported the operation. On March 16th, Crimea held a referendum under Russian military control. On March 18th, Vladimir Putin signed a treaty claiming the peninsula as part of Russia. 3 days later, Russian law completed the process. 22 days separated the seizure of Crimea's parliament from Russia's final ratification. On the first map, recognized by the United Nations, Crimea remained part of Ukraine. On the second, drawn by soldiers and checkpoints, it was controlled from Moscow. The border had not changed in law, it had changed in practice, and reversing that change meant confronting Russia directly. To understand why one peninsula carried that weight, we need to reconstruct the order that was supposed to protect it. In November 1990, 1 month after German reunification, leaders from Europe, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Canada met in Paris. The Soviet Union still existed, but the political division of Europe was ending. The document they signed announced a new era of democracy, peace, and unity. Even then, the promise was ahead of the reality. Yugoslavia, NATO's intervention in Kosovo, the invasion of Iraq, and the 2008 Russo-Georgian War had already exposed selective enforcement and the survival of territorial conflict. Georgia was the closest warning. After fighting escalated in South Ossetia, Russian forces advanced into Georgia, and Moscow recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent. It did not formally absorb them, and Europe treated the war as containable, but beneath those contradictions sat a clear legal rule. States could not use force against another state's territorial integrity or political independence. Borders could change through peaceful, lawful processes, not through conquest. The Helsinki Final Act affirmed sovereign equality and the inviolability of frontiers. Later OSCE texts paired every state's right freely to choose or change its security arrangements with the principle that no state should strengthen its security at another state's expense. Every participating state had accepted both ideas. Neither gave one country a veto over the choices of another. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe would monitor elections and conflict. The European Union would reduce the economic importance of borders. NATO would retain collective defense while extending partnerships eastward. The 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act declared that neither side considered the other an adversary. A formal council and practical cooperation followed. When Ukrainians voted for independence in December 1991, more than 90% supported it. Every region produced a majority, including Crimea and Sevastopol. Ukraine then inherited nuclear weapons stationed on its territory from the Soviet Union. Under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state. Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom recorded security assurances. They committed to respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and existing borders, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against it. These were not NATO-style guarantees. They contained no automatic promise to send troops, but the assurance not to attack Ukraine was explicit. Russia recognized the same borders again in a 1997 friendship treaty, while leasing naval facilities in Sevastopol. The relationship deteriorated as NATO and the European Union expanded eastward. Central and Eastern European states sought membership because of their own histories and security concerns. Moscow increasingly portrayed NATO's expansion as a threat and encirclement. At NATO's Bucharest summit in 2008, the alliance said Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join, while offering neither a timetable nor protection. The declaration angered Moscow without extending alliance security to either applicant. The result was an unstable middle position. Ukraine and Georgia had been promised eventual membership, but the promise changed neither country's immediate defense. Moscow could treat their movement toward the West as threatening, while knowing that NATO's mutual defense clause did not yet protect them. In Ukraine, that gap between political alignment and military protection would become crucial. By 2013, however, Ukraine was not approaching NATO membership. President Viktor Yanukovych had adopted a policy of non-alignment. The immediate dispute concerned an EU association agreement covering political reform and freer trade, not membership or military protection. The agreement was formally about trade and reform, but Moscow treated Ukraine's economic alignment as a strategic choice, and Yanukovych could no longer postpone making it. Viktor Yanukovych had won Ukraine's 2010 presidential election. International observers judged the vote competitive and broadly consistent with democratic standards. His political base was strongest in the east and south, but reducing Ukraine to two colored halves hides more than it explains. Language, identity, and voting behavior did not align neatly. Russian-speaking did not mean pro-Russian, and business networks crossed the apparent divide. Ukraine also remained deeply corrupt. Yanukovych concentrated power and wealth around his family as the economy deteriorated. The European agreement offered long-term integration and reforms, requiring difficult short-term economic and regulatory adjustment. Russia used trade restrictions and warnings to demonstrate what separation from its market could mean, while signaling that closer economic ties with Russia would bring immediate benefits. Yanukovych tried to bargain between the two sides. On November 21, his government suspended preparations to sign the European agreement. For Moscow, the suspension appeared to prevent Ukraine's westward economic turn. For many protesters, it confirmed that a president elected to balance between Russia and Europe had yielded under pressure. The dispute moved beyond the agreement itself. It became a contest over who could decide Ukraine's direction: the electorate, the presidency, the street, or a neighboring power. The first demonstrators who gathered on Kyiv's Independence Square were largely students and civic activists. Their demand was specific: sign the agreement. Then, in the early hours of November 30th, riot police violently dispersed the remaining protesters. The beating of the students brought many more Ukrainians into the square. The European agreement remained a symbol, but the confrontation now concerned police violence, corruption, and the authority of the president himself. For almost 3 months, protesters occupied central Kiev. Opposition parties competed for influence, while nationalist groups formed a visible minority at the movement's violent edge. The government alternated between negotiation and force. Restrictive protest laws passed in January intensified the clashes. Buildings burned, police and protesters used firearms. By February 21st, more than 100 people had died in connection with the protests, including more than 70 protesters shot dead and at least 13 police officers. Investigations into many of those deaths would remain incomplete. On February 21st, after the deadliest days of the uprising, Yanukovych and opposition leaders signed an agreement mediated by European foreign ministers. It called for constitutional reform, a national unity government, and an early presidential election. That night, Yanukovych left Kyiv. His security apparatus withdrew from central government buildings. Members of his own party defected. The following day, Parliament declared that he had removed himself from exercising his constitutional authority and scheduled an election for May. This was not the full impeachment procedure described by Ukraine's constitution. It was an emergency decision taken after the president had left the capital and the chain of government had broken. Its legality was contested then and remains contested. It did not give Russia a legal right to intervene. Yanukovych still had millions of supporters, especially in the east and south. Kyiv had changed governments. It had not produced national agreement. For the protesters, it was a revolution after months of state violence. For Moscow, it was an unconstitutional coup encouraged by the West. European and American officials openly engaged with Ukrainian actors across the crisis, but that influence does not erase Ukrainian agency. The new authorities in Kiev also made mistakes. Parliament voted to repeal a law that had given Russian and other minority languages official regional status. The acting president refused to sign the repeal, so it never took effect, but the vote itself sent a reckless signal at the worst possible moment. Russian media presented it as proof that Russian speakers faced an organized threat. The fall of Yanukovych caused genuine alarm in Crimea, which Russian messaging amplified. Some residents wanted closer ties with Russia. The alarm in Crimea created an opening. Russia's decision, nearby forces and speed turned that opening into an occupation. Crimea had been an autonomous republic within Ukraine. Russia's Black Sea Fleet operated from Sevastopol under bilateral agreements, placing Russian personnel and infrastructure on the peninsula before the crisis began. Those agreements granted access to specified facilities. They did not authorize Russia to take control of the peninsula. This made Crimea different from the rest of Ukraine. Russia did not need to move an invasion force across a defended international border before acting. Personnel, facilities and logistics were already present under legal agreements, while Ukraine's new authorities were still assembling a government. The bases did not make seizure lawful, but they reduced the time and visibility required to carry it out. Crimea had a majority ethnic Russian population and a returned Crimean Tatar community largely opposed to Russian rule. Some residents supported closer ties to Moscow or incorporation into Russia, but no free process measured the scale of that support in February or March 2014. On February 27, the armed men in Simferopol sealed the Crimean parliament. Behind guarded doors, deputies replaced the regional government and appointed Sergei Aksyonov as prime minister. A referendum was announced and then brought forward twice. More unmarked forces spread across the peninsula. They surrounded Ukrainian bases rather than storming most of them. Soldiers were pressured to defect. Commanders in Kyiv faced a calculation with no safe answer: resist and risk a larger war, or hold fire while control disappeared around them. The tactic bought Russia time at every level. Ukrainian commanders waited for orders. Kyiv feared that firing first would invite a wider assault. Foreign governments searched for language that matched an operation without insignia or declaration. Each pause was rational in isolation. Together, they allowed control to consolidate before any response could be organized. On March 1, Russia's Federation Council authorized the use of Russian armed forces in Ukraine. 3 days later, Putin said the armed men in Crimea were local self-defense units. Similar uniforms, he argued, could be bought in shops. On April 17, after the annexation was complete, he acknowledged that Russian servicemen had stood behind Crimea's self-defense forces. The missing insignia delayed a coordinated response. Ukraine knew it faced Russia, while other governments still debated how formally to describe the attack. The referendum took place on March 16th. The ballot offered two alternatives: joining the Russian Federation, or restoring a version of Crimea's 1992 constitution associated with much greater autonomy. There was no simple option to retain the existing arrangement. Russian forces already exercised effective control. Ukrainian television channels had been removed from local airwaves. The OSCE chair ruled out an observation mission because the vote lacked a constitutional framework, and Crimean Tatar leaders called for a boycott. The official result reported overwhelming support for joining Russia, but the conditions and legal framework did not produce a free, internationally valid act of self-determination. Ukraine's constitution required a nationwide vote to alter the country's territory. The Venice Commission concluded that the Crimean referendum was unconstitutional and that conditions on the peninsula prevented a vote meeting European democratic standards. On March 18th, Putin addressed the Russian parliament. He described Crimea as historically Russian, presented the government in Kyiv as the product of a coup, invoked the protection of Russian speakers, and accused Western states of applying international law selectively. Kosovo occupied a central place in the argument. If Kosovo could declare independence from Serbia, Moscow asked, why could Crimea not leave Ukraine? The Kosovo precedent helped Moscow describe annexation as consistency rather than conquest. But the cases differed at the points that mattered legally. Years of war and United Nations administration preceded Kosovo, and the court opinion concerned a declaration of independence, not annexation by a neighboring state. Crimea did not become an independent state. It was absorbed by Russia within days. The UN Security Council considered a resolution rejecting the referendum. Russia vetoed it. The question then moved to the General Assembly, where no state holds a veto. On March 27th, 100 countries voted to affirm Ukraine's territorial integrity and declare the referendum invalid as a basis for changing Crimea's status. 11 voted against. 58 abstained. The Budapest Memorandum now acquired a significance far beyond its short text. Ukraine had surrendered the nuclear arsenal stationed on its territory in a process linked to assurances that its existing borders would be respected. The memorandum required consultation, not automatic military intervention, but Russia's own undertaking to respect Ukraine's borders and refrain from force was unambiguous. International law continued to define Crimea as part of Ukraine. Russian soldiers, administrators, and currency defined daily life on the ground. Reversing that outcome would require far more than refusing to recognize it. In Crimea, Russia took control with most infrastructure intact. In eastern Ukraine, it would have to keep an armed movement alive through a war. March and April demonstrations contained competing demands in the east: federalization, language protections, separation, or continued unity with Ukraine. Protests became an armed territorial challenge when organized groups began seizing police stations, weapons, and government buildings. On April 6th, protesters occupied government offices in Donetsk and Luhansk. On April 12, a disciplined armed group led by Igor Girkin seized police and security buildings in Sloviansk. Girkin was a Russian citizen and former Federal Security Service officer. On April 14th, Kiev responded with what it called an anti-terrorist operation. Ukraine was confronting an armed territorial conflict with a neglected military. Units were poorly equipped, command was uncertain, and parts of the security apparatus had defected or dissolved. The movement drew on local anger and Ukrainian recruits, but Russian leadership, weapons, personnel, and financing allowed it to hold territory. The European Court of Human Rights later found that by May 11th, separatist operations were managed by Russia and areas under separatist control were under its effective control. Russia's denial reopened the same delay used in Crimea. First establish facts on the ground, then force other governments to prove who had created them. Violence was not confined to the Donbas. On May 2nd, clashes in Odessa culminated in a fire at the trade union's house. 48 people died in the day's violence. Official failures of prevention, rescue, and investigation turned a national trauma into potent propaganda. Separatist leaders proclaimed a Donetsk People's Republic on April 7th and a Luhansk People's Republic on April 27th. On May 11th, they held unrecognized votes in parts of both regions. The ballots met neither Ukrainian law nor international electoral standards, but helped organize armed control around the new entities. On May 25th, Petro Poroshenko won a presidential election that observers judged genuine despite voting being impossible in Crimea and much of the occupied east. It renewed political authority in Kiev without resolving the war. During June and early July, Ukrainian forces recovered ground. Sloviansk fell back under government control on July 5th. The separatist-held area contracted toward Donetsk and the Russian border. The summer campaign changed the stakes for Moscow. If Kiev restored the border and isolated the separatist-held cities, local anger alone was unlikely to preserve the armed entities. What had begun under cover of deniability now faced a choice: accept their defeat or commit enough Russian power to prevent it. The struggle over roads and crossings was therefore also a struggle over whether the war could continue. The air above the battlefield had already become dangerous. Several Ukrainian military aircraft had been shot down. Commercial airliners continued to cross the region at higher altitude. On July 17th, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 departed Amsterdam for Kuala Lumpur. There were 298 people on board. The aircraft broke apart over eastern Ukraine. Everyone aboard was killed. At the time, governments traded accusations and incomplete evidence. A Dutch-led investigation later traced the Buk launcher to Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade and identified its launch area in separatist-held territory. A Dutch court convicted 3 men and acquitted a 4th. The judgment did not identify the launcher crew, but found the 3 convicted men responsible for the deployment of the Buk. MH17 removed the distance between the war and Western Europe. A civilian aircraft that had departed Amsterdam was destroyed over separatist-held territory in a conflict Russia still presented as an internal Ukrainian struggle. Within 2 weeks, the European Union moved from penalties against individuals to sanctions on sectors of the Russian economy. On the battlefield, Ukrainian forces continued to advance until late August. Then Russian regular forces entered the fighting more directly. Ukrainian units were encircled near Ilovaisk and suffered severe losses while attempting to withdraw. Subsequent investigations and judicial findings documented Russia's decisive military, political and economic role in separatist-held areas, along with regular Russian forces in the late August fighting. Moscow denied that its armed forces were conducting a war in Ukraine, describing captured personnel as volunteers or soldiers who had crossed accidentally. On September 5th, representatives of Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, and the separatist-controlled areas signed the Minsk Protocol. It called for a ceasefire, OSCE monitoring of the border, decentralization, and other political measures. The ceasefire reduced some fighting, but never secured peace. Its clauses depended on an order of implementation the parties did not share. Ukraine demanded security and border control. Russia and the separatist authorities emphasized political status. Each side accused the other of violations while the front remained armed. By late autumn, more than 4,000 people had been killed in the eastern conflict, including the passengers and crew of MH17. Civilians suffered shelling, detention, disappearance, and displacement. The United Nations documented abuses by separatist forces as well as Ukrainian units and volunteer battalions. Abuses by Ukrainian and separatist forces require separate accounting, but the conflict's scale and endurance depended on Russian direction, supply, and by late August, regular forces. By year's end, the front had hardened well inside Ukraine. By the time the response cohered, Russia controlled Crimea and Ukrainian forces had been stopped near Ilovaisk. Western policy could now punish and deter. Reversing those outcomes meant direct war. The sequence mattered. Crimea was annexed before sectoral sanctions existed. Broader European Union measures followed only after MH17, when the political cost of restraint rose sharply across Europe. The response was not a single decision made in February. It accumulated as attribution strengthened, casualties mounted, and consensus became possible. The OSCE documented the fighting. The United Nations rejected annexation. The other 7 members suspended Russia's participation in the G8, and Western sanctions restricted finance, technology, and travel, while preserving non-recognition. The UN Security Council could not act on Crimea's status against Russia's veto, so the General Assembly supplied political condemnation rather than enforcement. OSCE monitors could report what they reached, but they were unarmed and repeatedly faced restrictions. The institutions established a public record and a common legal position. Sanctions required evidence, negotiation, legislation, and cooperation among governments with different exposure to Russian trade and energy. Their pressure accumulated slowly. Russian companies relied on Western capital and technology, while European states relied heavily on Russian energy. The sanctions were designed to raise long-term costs, not to retake territory. They limited major state-owned banks' access to European capital, restricted arms and dual-use trade, and blocked selected energy technology. Their durability depended on keeping many governments aligned. Direct military intervention carried a different risk. Ukraine was a NATO partner, not an ally. Article 5 did not apply. Attempting to expel Russian forces from Crimea would have meant a direct conflict with a nuclear-armed state. Western governments drew the boundary at direct war with Russia, support Ukraine, reject annexation, and impose economic costs, but do not fight to retake Crimea. In 2014, the United States limited its security assistance to non-lethal equipment. That policy reflected caution about escalation, as well as doubts about the condition of Ukraine's armed forces. It also made the enforcement boundary visible to Moscow and Kiev. NATO changed its own posture. In April, it suspended practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia while keeping political channels open. At the Wales summit in September, Allied leaders said Russia's actions had fundamentally challenged the vision of a Europe whole, free and at peace. The alliance adopted a readiness action plan, expanded reassurance measures for Eastern members, and began creating a force capable of deploying more quickly. Members also pledged to halt declines in defense spending and move toward 2% of GDP over the following decade. Cooperation with Russia was no longer the organizing assumption. Deterrence returned to the center of NATO planning. On June 27th, the European Union and Ukraine signed the remaining economic chapters of the association agreement. Its political provisions had been signed on March 21st. These institutions could preserve the legal border, document violations, and coordinate costs. None offered a low-risk way to remove Russian forces already in place. – 2014 was not the first violation of Europe's post-Cold War rules. It was the year a recognized border and effective control diverged on a scale the existing system could not reverse. Europe's order had already survived selective enforcement, frozen conflicts, and war. Western states applied principles inconsistently. Russia had already used force in its neighborhood, and arms control arrangements were eroding. In Ukraine, three expectations proved unreliable: that recognized borders were protected from forcible annexation, that economic interdependence made such action too costly, and that states between Russia and the West could choose their relationships without becoming objects in a contest over spheres of influence. Russia's method exploited the delay between action, attribution, and collective response. By the time evidence produced consensus, the operation in Crimea was complete. The law survived. The assumption that economic ties and written commitments would usually prevent this kind of seizure did not. A treaty could record a border. Protecting that border required deterrence, political will, and a credible answer to escalation. Those elements were strong inside NATO and far weaker in the contested space beyond it. The larger invasion remained a choice, not a scheduled consequence. Between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine held elections, pursued reforms, and rebuilt its armed forces. Russia integrated Crimea, sustained the separatist entities, and increased military pressure. European states maintained sanctions while preserving major economic relationships with Moscow. That failure of deterrence did not transfer responsibility for Russia's decisions. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion across Ukraine, expanding the war it had begun in 2014. NATO again defined Russia as a direct threat, while Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. In 2014, negotiated settlements remained possible, and every government retained alternatives. The year did not predict an unavoidable future. It established conditions under which a larger war became easier to imagine and harder to prevent. The institutions endured. The United Nations still recognized Ukraine's border. NATO still deterred attacks on its members. Sanctions and courts still imposed costs. What failed was the belief that agreements and interdependence could protect states beyond the alliance without a credible means of enforcement. The durable change was strategic as much as territorial. Russia had demonstrated that speed, ambiguity, and escalation risk could defeat collective decision-making outside NATO territory. Western governments had demonstrated where their own threshold for direct intervention lay. The map created in 2014 therefore remains divided. One version records the border recognized by law. The other records the territory held by force. Europe has been living inside the distance between them ever since.